some of the experience that are faced by ethnically diverse women in journalism, and also issues of identity, tokenism, discrimination, and navigating race as writers and in publishing. So it'd be really great if you both could just start by introducing yourselves and tell us a bit about your individual journeys into journalism. I don't know who wants to start, but I'll hand it over to you.
I can start. Yeah, okay. So hi everybody, I'm Natalie. I've been a journalist for about 10 years now, working across a whole spectrum of different kinds of journalism, really. I started in magazines, and then I went over to broadcast and was a producer and reporter for ITV News, ITV London and National. And then I was the deputy lifestyle editor at Metro Online for about 3.5 years, which was a brilliant role. Had loads of autonomy, got to cover loads of different things, really enjoyed it. But yes, and now I've just started my kind of freelance journey about 4-ish months ago. So I'm still very fresh to freelance world, but I'm loving it so far. It's really varied, really liking that my weeks are totally different, and I'm getting to say yes to a lot of new opportunities, which is really, really fun, and is expanding my horizons within journalism, which is great. And I also published my first book last year, which is called Mixed Other, which is a non-fiction exploration of what it means to be mixed in the UK today. So yeah, that's kind of me.
Hi, can I introduce myself? I
Oh
just
yeah,
didn't,
sure.
yeah, I didn't get the last part, so I wasn't sure if it was done. It just froze. Um, Thanks, Natalie. Nice to meet you. Hi everyone. I am Meehika. I've been a freelance journalist for 5 years now. I cover everything from lifestyle and travel to social issues, tech, etc. It just kind of depends on which month of the year we're talking about. Right now, it's just holiday gift guides and New Year resolution and happy stuff. Um, and yeah, I have worked for newspapers such as The Guardian, um, the New York Times, Washington Post, and also for magazines such as Vogue, Elle magazine, Grazia, all sorts of stuff. Half of my work is US based and the other half is UK based. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
No, fab, thank you. And thank you for both being here as well. So obviously the series is based around equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I wanted to start with that. It's quite a big question. So do you think the industry is doing enough to support and empower those from a racially diverse background, creating a space, if at all, for them within journalism, especially since both of you, like you just mentioned, have written lines for large, well-known publications like Metro, The Independent, and all the ones you mentioned as well. If we could start with Natalie, that'd be great.
Short answer is no. I think we're miles away from what needs to be happening within the industry in terms of empowerment and creating space and support. And you know, it is part of the reason why I've ended up going freelance, because the newsrooms that I've worked in have been so lacking in those areas for journalists of colour, particularly women of colour, particularly if you write about issues to do with race and identity, which has been a lot of kind of my remit. When I was at Metro, I was writing a lot about racism, social justice, anti-racism, around, you know, what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement and before that. And it was a struggle because the people above me didn't have a particularly huge amount of knowledge in that area, didn't really know how to support me, and my colleagues who were working on these kind of topics, and there wasn't a lot of support there, really. I think that is the key word that is lacking. so it's not the most positive of answers for you, unfortunately. I think there's still a huge amount of work to do in that area. I think it has to be a top-down kind of situation. This can't be something that the most junior members of the team are fighting for every day, because it's exhausting and incredibly taxing, both emotionally and professionally, and it drains people and it burns people out. So I think what needs to happen is that we need to have people in those positions of power within newsrooms who are aware of these issues and who are much better versed at talking about them, creating space, and even just understanding the kinds of issues that might arise, because there is such a gap. People don't even understand what problems there might be, let alone tackling those problems. So yeah, long way to go, I think.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Meehika?
I totally agree with Natalie. I mean, I still remember this was, I guess, 2018. I was doing a shift at a very big national magazine, and the entire masthead was white. There was not one person of color. The interns were white, and I guess this was, no, it had to be 2017, I guess, or 2017 or 2018. I remember it was like an internship and freelance shift I was doing. But anyway, I remember like there was 2 fashion interns who messed up this very big shoot. And the director was really angry and was screaming at the assistant. So I had felt bad for those interns, and I went to the fashion closet and I was like, oh, can I help you guys? And they were like, yes, we're drowning in returns, etc. And I said, oh, I'm really sorry about the mess up. It sounded really serious. And these guys had no idea what I was talking about, because their assistant had taken the blame. So the interns absolutely had no idea they'd messed up. And I remember the assistant later coming to me, clearing the entire fashion closet and saying, I'm sorry, you don't belong here. You're in the features desk. It was like, you could see the microaggressions, and I was like, oh, I'm just trying to help. They're like, no, don't talk back to me. And I was like, I'm not the one who made a mistake here. Like, I didn't mess up an entire shoot. Like, I couldn't understand back then, I was so young, as to why I was the one who was being treated that way, whereas these interns messed up an entire shoot worth thousands of pounds. And I could not understand what was happening. And I guess when I spoke to other journalists of color about this, because I was so confused, they were like, well, you were the only person of color in the entire magazine. So that's why the microaggressions. But yeah, like I always give this example because I just think it just kind of, you know, sums up the point that it's not just about diversity, but also about the fact that it's about gatekeeping. It's about those microaggressions, bullying, and so many other things that happen that people don't talk about.
Yeah, I think you've made a really significant point there, actually, and it's definitely important to like talk about these experiences, because I think that's the only way that people actually know any things like this actually go on behind the scenes. If people don't talk about their experiences, you never really know what's happening in newsrooms and kind of what the media industry, the things that you have to deal with as a person of color, or a minority group. I think that is also actually a good lead into our next question. Obviously, there are clearly issues surrounding the progression of non-white journalists into more senior editorial roles. And we actually upon doing some research, we found a report published in May this year found that those from ethnic minority backgrounds only make up 14% of journalists and reporters and only 10% of editors. So when we take those statistics and actually kind of, voice that, it's quite shocking, really. So I want to ask both of you, why do you think that is? Why is it so problematic? And maybe what are some of the barriers that, people of colour are facing to progress into those senior roles?
Well, I think the journalism is historically an incredibly elitist profession to go into. It's not particularly well paid, particularly at the bottom of the profession. When you're on the bottom rungs of the ladder, you often have to work unpaid in internships. You have to have access to those spaces. I've seen firsthand, it'll be the editor's nephew and nieces who are there doing work experience, or getting those weekly that experience in those spaces that just isn't accessible to most people. So you have to know the right people. Often it's not just something that's posted up on LinkedIn and you can just come in. So it's hard to get a foot in the door, first of all, if you're not from a very specific kind of background. There's a huge number of journalists are from private schools, privately educated, went to a very small number of universities. On the trainee scheme that I did at ITV News, I was the only person on that course who didn't do this one specific journalism course at City University. That's the MA there. And I'm like, what a mad thing that of thousands of people who applied to this this trainee scheme, and I think 10 people got spots, 9 out of 10 were from the same course, from one university. So if that's not like incredibly elitist, I don't know what it is. So we're not getting that broad spectrum of people entering the profession in the first place. And yeah, there are many barriers, obvious ones like the ones I've mentioned, but also invisible ones, in that the way that so many people hiring in those newsrooms are white, middle-aged, middle class or upper middle class, and there are biases that we're aware of that impact hiring, in terms of people hiring people they recognize, they see themselves in, people who they think are like their daughter or their son. So that immediately puts you on the back foot in terms of getting in the room in the first instance. And then in terms of the barriers that exist when you're in those spaces, they are just myriad. There's loads of them. And I think I always say that there's, you've heard of the glass ceiling for women in the workplace. And I think there are many, many more glass ceilings that exist for people in minority groups, and particularly women who intersect multiple minority groups. And that often, I think, comes down to the fact that there's this wall that stops you getting from a certain point to the next, and that is, you get to kind of like mid senior level, and then there's nowhere to go. I've seen people being overlooked again and again, not being hired, being passed over. Their contributions aren't being recognized. They're seeming to be held to a different standard to their white colleagues. Their expectations are much higher. And then people leave because these spaces aren't really built for people from minority groups to thrive. And I find what often happens at the moment is there are plenty of diversity schemes that get people into the room at the bottom layers, but then nothing in place when you're actually in those spaces to help you do well. So it's almost like, cool, we've got them in the room, tick that box, job done. But really, these spaces are not built to enable you to do well. So you come up against barrier after barrier, your story ideas are shot down, you're not listened to in meetings, you're not given the opportunity to prove yourself or to impress people. And as a result, you don't progress, or you end up being fired in some cases, or leaving because you think, I can't progress here. And that almost then reinforces the idea that, you know, people from different backgrounds, oh, they don't do well in this profession. But really, we're not given the space to do well very often. So I think that's the kind of the key pattern that I keep seeing again and again across newsrooms. And I'm not really sure how to break it, because like I said before, the change needs to be top down. But in order to do that, I don't know how we change the top of the pecking order, because it's been built so that you can't change it, because obviously that protects the people who are at the top. So it's a really difficult one, and I think it will involve some deep structural changes to how these hierarchies of power work within newsrooms and within journalism generally.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that, because if, like you said, we still have, you know, certain demographics that are controlling the newsrooms at the top, it doesn't really leave much room for change, because, you know, if they're not hiring different ethnic groups, and they're not being promoted and they're not being able to progress, then more doors can't be opened for, you know, the rest of us. Meehika, did you have anything to contribute on that as well?
I definitely think it has a lot to do with mentorship as well. Like, I think there aren't a lot of mentorship schemes for people of color, because if you're in the same mentorship scheme as the, you know, like other people, those advice, it works for them, but it doesn't work for us. So for the for the non-white journalists, those things just don't work. So yeah, there, as Natalie said, there isn't enough resources for us to navigate once you're in the newsroom. And a lot of the times, especially what happened with me when I saw how magazines work, I was like, I can't put up with this. I don't want to put up with this. Why will I put myself in such a situation? And that was one of the key decisions for me to be freelance and create my own opportunities, because I was not okay with dealing with microaggressions. And I'd heard about these things happening in women's magazines for a long time, but I thought I could power through it. But then when I got there, everything I just had was kind of confirmed. I don't know how it is now, but I have never gone back ever since. And like, a lot of things will have to change for me to go back there. But I always tell other journalists of color that you don't really, like, you can always create your own opportunities. You can also kind of like do freelance on the side, and then when you're comfortable, then you can just sort of like move completely over. Or you know, like, even in terms of stepping up above the mid seniority level, I always say, like, find another journalist who's been in the same shoe as you have, reach out to them, ask them how they navigated it, because otherwise you're out of depth here. Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, the mentorship scheme is a really interesting one. Obviously, like Natalie was saying, with the higher levels, perhaps as high as you go, there's less options for people of colour to do those mentorship schemes, but they're obviously really important. I think that's something that definitely needs to happen. And leading on from that, I know, Meehika, when you posted on Instagram this morning about being pigeonholed into covering race issues, and I just wanted to talk about instances of tokenism and the tick box approach, and it would be great if you guys could share some of those experiences and how you've overcome them or attempted to strike a balance with your content, because obviously you want to discuss race and representation, but you also want to cover things that you're really passionate about, and that may not fit into that box. Yeah, Meehika, if you could continue, and then we'll go to Natalie again.
Yeah, I mean, this happened like 2 years ago, when I realized I was always being commissioned to write about race issues, which is great, and I'm really passionate about it. But that was all I was doing. And every single time I pitched a piece that had nothing to do with race or diversity, my editors were like, no, no. And then they'd come back to me with another idea about race. And then I realized, well, that was my mistake because I kept pitching those stories. So probably I gave the impression that I was just interested in covering that beat. So I had to completely make a shift and sort of yeah, like also educate myself about it, in the sense like when other writers of color were speaking that, we want to write about other fun things too, or whatever we want. So there was a lot of like discussion around this last year where writers of color were talking about how white journalists are able to pick and choose whatever they want to write about, but they don't have the same privilege. And so you have to consciously and actively make sure you don't get pigeonholed in that, because it's really easy as a writer of color to just, and you don't realize it. I actually didn't realize it because I'm so passionate about it. But then when I saw that it was getting harder for me to write about anything else, that's when I made a conscious decision to step back from the race stories and give equal time to other stories as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think also that it's up to editors to have more of an imagination. How we have the range as writers of color, as journalists of color, to write about a whole spectrum of things, just as white writers do. And yes, it is up to us to make sure we're pitching those stories and not pigeonholing ourselves. But I think actually it's the editors who pigeonhole us. They're the ones who put us in this little tight box and don't give us the freedom. And the fact that you're not being commissioned, Meehika, for other things, even though you're pitching them, I think is a really damning indictment on your editors for not trusting you, for not realizing that you can do that. And I think that's a massive shortcoming on the editor's side of things, and it's up to people who are commissioning to be a bit bolder and to not be predictable, because that's also just going to massively improve your coverage and your content generally, because getting different perspectives, people from different backgrounds, whether that is race or whether it's class or age or regionality within the UK, getting different spectrum of voices on whatever the topic is for today is really beneficial. So whatever that is, think about broadening your pool of writers. You don't have to go for the same narrow field of people write about certain things. There's so much crossover in this industry, and I would say that for writers of color, like there is so much pressure on both sides of it, either to write about race or to not write about race, because people say, oh, you're just the token black girl talking about racism again. And I've actually found that quite difficult, because like you, Meehika, I want to write about race and social injustice and racism. Like I feel like compelled to, as much as it can be exhausting. And some days I used to come into the office and my colleagues would be writing about like the latest Fenty makeup or whatever it was, and I was like, that looks like a nice day. I'm over here writing about something horrible that's gonna like make me personally sad and stressed. But at the same time, I want to do that and I feel a responsibility. Rightly or wrongly, that is how I feel, and I want to do it. So I also don't always think that you have to steer yourself away from that if it's something that you do care about, if you have a lived experience and the right kind of voice to do that. Because sometimes I'm like, well, if I don't write about this topic, I know there's no one else in my newsroom who's going to pick it up today, and then it's not going to be spoken about, and I think it's an important story. So it's really finding a balance of what you want to do, and like it should just be the case that the same as with white journalists, you get to follow your passion. And if that passion is related to your heritage and your identity as a Black or brown woman, cool, go do that. If that's travel or beauty or politics or whatever it is, that there shouldn't be any barrier or any kind of additional expectations on your shoulders. And as a writer, as a young journalist breaking into the industry, it's not up to you to make sure people see you like that. That should be on the editors and the people commissioning you to realize that you have the breadth to cover a multitude of different things.
Yeah, and also I feel like you're right in the sense it's not fair for editors to keep asking the writers to relive their trauma.
Yeah.
Like, that's just horrific. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, so you made really really good points there, actually. And even with the previous question, it's funny because you were talking about kind of how people of color have to create their own platforms and create their own opportunities to kind of break into these industries that are so, you know, elitist or exclusive. And I kind of always compare it to even acting and film now, because you're seeing the same thing with the film industry, especially with minority groups that are actually, you know, producing their own work now, trying to break into production so that they can, you know, there's more accurate representation and diversity seen on TV and film, which is amazing. I'm also going to talk about what you guys have actually been doing. So you both contribute so much to creating a positive culture for those within the industry. Natalie, for your series Mixed Up, which has given a voice to underrepresented narratives, and you know, you've been championing the BAME pay gap campaign at ITN. And Meehika, you were actually nominated for Journalist of the Year this year at the Asian Media Awards, alongside having written for large publications like British Vogue, in which you were challenging Eurocentric norms and raising awareness around social issues, which is, you know, all amazing stuff. So what my question is that why do you think this advocacy is so important, and what are you both aiming to achieve through doing so? You want to start, Meehika?
Yeah, of course. I think, like, obviously for me as like an Indian woman, and also understanding that I did not grow up in the UK, so I was born and brought up in New Delhi. I came here on a fellowship with Reuters to London and stayed here ever since then. So for me, it's quite important, because when I got into this industry and I realized how elitist and white it is, there were often times where it was not directly said to me, but somewhat in an indirect way, that you'd never, because I'm like, I was doing just magazines back then, because I thought I wanted to be a fashion editor or something like that. So it was conveyed to me indirectly that you'd never understand the British or the American luxury market. And I had to prove them wrong. So because, and that's the thing, like, I think people of color are underestimated so much. I'm just laughing because I was so young back then, but for me, that's why it's important, because it was outrightly like gatekeeping, that you could just see. So this is one of the reasons why I'm always talking about it and always doing panels, so that it creates opportunity for other people. And they don't have to hear the same thing. Like, it really doesn't matter where you come from. Like, I grew up reading these magazines. So for me, I mean, even though the messaging was being given to me, that ever understand the British and American luxury market, I knew in myself that I read these magazines growing up, like I know as much about them as the other person. So yeah, I think like that's one of the reasons why I try so very hard to just push this as much as I can.
Yeah, that's I love that story. That kind of proving people wrong. That's definitely part of my ethos as well. But I think for me, what I want to achieve when I write, when I publish my book, or whenever I publish a feature, is this kind of that sense of recognition. I think that's, as a writer, that's always what I'm looking for. I want somebody to, this is a cliche, but to like feel seen, and to feel heard, when they read my words, and that kind of that nod of recognition where, you know, when you read something and you're just like, oh, somebody has taken a thought that I thought was my own, or an experience that I thought was only, you know, a private thing that only I had gone through, or something that I found difficult to articulate, and put it down into words, so that now I can see it and I feel less alone. I know there's somebody else who has been through this. That's always what I'm looking for, because for me, that's always been, as a reader, as someone who consumes content, that's always been the most powerful element of journalism and of writing, both fiction and non-fiction, is when I'm like, oh my gosh, that jolt of like, wow, somebody else feels this isn't just me and my mad brain thinking things up, like this is a universal experience. So to bring something that hasn't been spoken about, and to make it universal, to make it public in that way, I think it's a real privilege of having a platform, and something that I feel is a real responsibility, which is why I choose the topics that I choose. I choose to tell the stories that I tell, and to talk to the people that I talk to, the people who don't necessarily get many opportunities, to tell their stories, to be in those pages, and to bring them out into spaces that have very little awareness of these different worlds. And that's, I think, been one of the major benefits for writing for places like Metro, like The Independent, like The Guardian, in that I'm bringing some of these stories to an audience that would have no other frame of reference for this. They don't necessarily know many women of color. They maybe don't know that many working class people, or people from outside of like London and the southern counties. So to kind of bring different perspectives to those audiences is something that's really important to me, and yeah, and makes the job worth doing when you get an email from someone who's like, wow, I've read your article and I didn't realize anybody else felt this, and it's, you know, it's really helped me. That's literally the whole reason I do what I do. So that's kind of what keeps me going, and why that kind of advocacy element of my job is so important to me. And then just additionally, it's to do with representation, not necessarily in the newsroom, but representing the public, because I think as journalists, our job is to tell stories that matter to the country. We are the ones who decide what people should think is important, what people should think is an outrage, what people should be talking about, what people should be campaigning against. It's the news, it's the front pages of the newspapers, it's the news at 10, it's what's on social media. That is literally setting the agenda. It's setting the agenda of what's happening on our WhatsApp chats, the conversations we're having around the table with our families, in schools. And that is an enormous responsibility. And that's why I think it's so vital that newsrooms accurately and fairly represent the country that we're talking about. And at the moment, we're so far away from that. How is it possibly fair that, and you know, the 1%, 2%, 3% of elite, white, privately educated, mostly men, are deciding what are the most important stories for this country to be talking about. So I think it's a huge responsibility to accurately and fairly represent communities, and give them all space, give those different stories space, because they need to be heard.
Yeah, really, like, again, inspirational as well, talking about that. And actually, I think, yeah, this leads on really well actually to, again, what we're going to discuss next. So obviously, I am conscious of time. So I'm just going to go on to any advice that you both want to offer women from ethnic minority backgrounds also wanting to make an impact on their workplace about how they could go about doing so. I think you've kind of touched on some things already. And for example, obviously with Natalie, you've set up the BAME Journalist Safeguarding Network to tackle racist online abuse towards non-white journalists. So do you maybe have any advice on how, other women could maybe even set up their own kind of networks as well, or how they should go about doing those kind of initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my advice would be that you don't have to do that. You shouldn't have to do that. And that
Yeah,
is a massive additional burden to take on alongside your job. And I think there's always a huge kind of expectation on people of color to be the ones in your newsroom who are taking on that additional work for no extra pay or recognition or thanks often. So I think my advice would be only take on the battles that you feel you have the energy for, because journalism is hard enough as it is, your job is hard enough as it is, you're being overworked and underpaid most likely. So to also ask you to be setting up networks and groups and support things, it's not fair, and it shouldn't be on you, it shouldn't be on individuals. You can send strongly worded emails to your superiors and tell them, to HR, to tell them this is what you need, to encourage them to give you that support. But my advice would be that you shouldn't have to do that. If you're in a space where you feel that is needed and you're not getting the support from above, know when to leave. I would say as well, know when you're not going to get that, because you can spend months, years banging your head against a brick wall trying to get people to listen to you, trying to get people to understand what you're going through, and if they're not going to do it, then that's not the right place for you. So I think, yeah, protect your peace would be my main advice.
yeah, amazing. So both of you write and report on obviously race and representation, which we've already discussed, and you both contribute to a growing space of diverse narratives. So in relation to the coverage of ethnic minorities within the media, why do you think it's pivotal to have people who identify with these groups like yourselves reporting on such stories, benefiting not just journalists, but also media consumers? For example, Natalie, you cover a lot about sport and lifestyle and how that interests with, the experiences of predominantly Black women. And Meehika, you often cover an overlap between fashion or entertainment within the Asian community. I think I'm going to start with Meehika because I'm really interested in also just finding out on your reporting experiences, because I know you've reported in from London and Delhi as well, on national and international news. So I also want to, maybe if you could touch on, maybe there's been any differences as well with reporting from both, locations and yeah, just your experiences in both countries.
I mean, I was quite shocked, honestly, when I was reporting from Delhi. I was in touch with a lot of foreign correspondents from the Times, the Guardian, Telegraph. So all of the South Asia correspondents were based in New Delhi, and all of them are white. And my mentor and I used to always have this conversation where I just could not understand why these publications cannot employ a person of color in these countries, like whether it's someone who is British or whether it's someone who's Indian, because it absolutely made no sense whatsoever to have a white reporter report on these stories that they had no idea. Um, it was so unfair also because a lot of these correspondents had stringers who would translate for them, who would explain them context, who would explain them why this is important. So basically, someone else is doing the work and you're just writing a story. And I saw that so closely, and I still don't know how it's going on, why it's going on. Like, if you're sending a person to India, why aren't you sending like a person of color, at least a British Indian person who knows the context and does not have to hire locals to make them understand that. So yeah, I mean, they're still there, so it's still happening. It's just hilarious to me. Um, but for me, also, when I see in the UK, a lot of the times the same thing happens when white journalists are reporting on stories of race. A lot of the time, they say very tone-deaf things, and then the publication gets into a big controversy, and then someone has to issue an apology on Twitter. And in my head, I'm like, this is so easy. All you had to do was assign the story to a person of color. Why did you assign this race story to a white journalist? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know how it keeps happening. I see it all the time, every single time someone is apologizing. Um, so yeah, I don't know how long it's going to take for them to realize the solution is so easy. And I don't understand why they're not doing that. Do they think white writers are more capable of writing a story on race than the person of that race? I just don't understand the logic behind it. So yeah.
I mean, yeah, you definitely make a really good point about. I mean, it's quite interesting to even hear that, because I didn't think that even in India or like any in other countries, they are still they're still predominantly like white kind of journalists or white people that are taking up those roles, and to the fact that they're still not hiring people of color even in those countries where actually minority groups are kind of make up the majority. Yeah, that's definitely really interesting, actually enlightening for me. And yeah, so Natalie, I think going back to the question of covering sport and lifestyle, and obviously you talk about the experiences of predominantly Black women with both of those topics. So why, again, so the question was, yeah, so why do you think it's important to have people identifying with these groups reporting on those stories, and also maybe why you've chosen to focus on those particular, like, specific sections?
Yeah, well, it's like what Meehika said in terms of the like, white people get it wrong all the time, and it's embarrassing for their newsrooms and for everybody who has to witness it over and over again. And it's ridiculous that it keeps happening. It's just like Meehika said, it's a very simple fix. I why it's not happening is because there aren't people in those newsrooms. There aren't enough of us. There's not enough people there to be like, hang on, that's the wrong Black guy. That's not Stormzy or whoever it is that they've got wrong that day. And that I think is probably the most telling proof that there aren't enough people of color in those rooms to call people out when it's mistakes like that, or when it's problematic headlines, which I think often people assume that they're malicious, and sometimes they are with certain sections of the tabloid press. There is obviously a right-wing element to that, and sometimes these are conscious decisions to be inflammatory about race. But I think also what happens is that people aren't aware that some of the headlines or the language that they use is problematic or offensive. And that's when it gets really complicated, because then you're creating a drama unintentionally, and it doesn't need to happen in that way. But there aren't the people in those rooms, or the people who are in those rooms aren't in a position to question or call it out. I've had to, when I was at Metro, I called out headlines about Meghan Markle that I thought were needlessly aggressive towards her, and I thought racially insensitive, and because I was in a senior position, I was able to do that, but not everybody could. Also, I wasn't always listened to. Sometimes they'd be like, okay, we note your complaint and we're keeping the headline the same, and I'd be like, okay, well, there's not really much more you can do in that situation. So yeah, I also feel bad for the journalists of color who are in those newsrooms when these kind of stories break and these scandals happen on Twitter, because I'm like, oh, they probably did say something. They probably did say, oh, we can't say that, and they were probably overridden by more senior people. So it's really complicated, and comes back down to the same central fact that newsrooms are too white, and too kind of too narrow in who's in there. There's not enough diversity in those newsrooms. There's so many reasons why that's a problem. So this is another one. And yeah, second part of your question, why have I chosen to focus on lifestyle and sport? Well, they're just two other things that I do. I do lots of other things as well, but it's just what I'm interested in. I think lifestyle is a really nice broad brush. Like, that can mean so many things. Like, the fact that for me so much of my lifestyle writing was about racism I think tells you everything. Where it could also be about makeup or sex or mental health or work. Like, there's so many things that fall under that brush, which is why I like it, because it's really varied. And sport, I'm a netball player, so I just like talking about that stuff personally. So yeah, it's kind of proof that you don't have to be pigeonholed. Of course, you can talk about the things that interest you, and I think that makes for some of the strongest writing, when you are actually personally invested in what you're talking about, and deeply genuinely interested in the subjects that you're covering, which is a real privilege, and not everybody gets to do that in their journalism career, particularly early on. So if you find yourself in a position where you're able to write about things that you're genuinely passionate about, cling on to that, because you don't always get to do that as a journalist.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, because I think in terms of writing about what you're passionate about, but also you said you felt a slight responsibility to write about race and representation. I think it's integral to having people from those minority backgrounds supporting, because I feel as though they bring a more authentic and insightful perspective that white people wouldn't be able to give, or like first-hand experiences always kind of inform the way you write and your voice. So yeah, I totally agree. I'm just conscious of the time. We've only got 5 minutes left. We did start a little bit late, so I'm hoping it's okay. We could run over a couple minutes. But I wanted to open the floor. We talked about so much in just under an hour. I don't know how we've covered it all, but if anyone has a question, you can pop it in the chat now, or come on, unmute yourselves and ask questions for Natalie and Meehika. So I'll open the floor now.
Hi, I had a question. First off, hi, I'm Alina. I'm a journalism student from California, and I'm also one of the 2 people of color on my team at my college's radio station, and I constantly deal with imposter syndrome. So I was going to ask, what advice would you give to someone who's scared of opportunity because of the imposter syndrome they might face?
I would definitely say it's something you have to actively, because I relate a lot with it, but that only goes away with action. So definitely remind yourself every single time that while you're questioning yourself, another white writer or journalist is completely okay with, getting that position, or even if they're not qualified for it. It happens so much in the industry when someone who's not qualified for something, they get the job because they were just from the same background and had the same education as the person who was hiring. So that was my motivation every single time. I told myself, when I was even negotiating rates, that a white male writer is getting paid twice more than me. So if I don't say anything, I just let that, I give it a green light. So that's why it's crucial for you keep pushing yourself, and every single time you doubt yourself, just remind yourself that.
I totally agree with that. And thanks for that question as well. I think it's a great question. And I think also it's something that will continue to plague you, unfortunately, because it still plagues me 10 years into my career. So, I wouldn't be too harsh on yourself or think that, nobody else is feeling like that, because I think it's not the case at all. The more I go through my career, the more I realize everybody is just like kind of blagging a little bit. Everybody's trying to just, put on this front. And I'm like, oh, okay, no one has got it all figured out, actually, even the really senior people. So I would give yourself a bit of a break on that. Like, it's very, very normal to doubt yourself. And yeah, but like Meehika says, pushing through is an amazing thing to do if you can do it. I spent years in newsrooms sitting silently in meetings, so silent, and then I'd come out and I'd feel so annoyed that somebody else had said my idea and I couldn't find my voice. It was like on the tip of my tongue. I was like, and I'd be in my head like, say it, just say it, say the words, and I couldn't say them. And that happened for years. So, and it doesn't mean you can't progress. It doesn't mean you're not going to get anywhere in your career. You will, because everybody feels like that at the beginning. So don't worry too much about it. You will naturally become more confident the more you are in newsrooms, the more you progress through your career, the older you get. That's just one of the benefits of getting older and being more confident and giving less shits about what people think or what they think about your idea. So that will just come. So yeah, don't worry, it will happen.
Yeah, thank you. Great advice. Do you mind if we run over a couple of minutes, just because we did start a teeny bit later?
Yeah, that's fine.
Fab. So does anyone else have a question? We can go with.
Sorry, I forgot my tape was over my camera. But I'm Molly. Hi guys, nice to meet you all. It's been so lovely and refreshing to listen to you all speak. But less of a question. I just wanted to say, I think it was yourself asking how we heard of the event, and I was lucky actually. I just went on to Eventbrite and I seen it, so I just wanted to let you know. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I qualified in broadcast journalism in 2020, so a couple of years ago now. I don't actually work in the industry at the minute, other than I have a radio show on a Saturday where I love to speak about like diversity and stuff. So I think this will give me a lot of content for tomorrow, and yeah, I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for sharing your experiences.
No, thanks you so much for coming. Yeah, if you want to pop your radio show in the chat, we could advertise it on Empowered. It sounds great.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be great. And if any of you would like to ever come on and speak, like I say, it's been great to connect. So I'd definitely like to stay in contact.
Is that a Mancunian accent, Molly?
It is, yeah.
Love to hear it. Love to hear it.
Are you from Manchester as well?
I am, yeah. I'm from
Are you? I'm from Stretford. I did check out your social media and Meehika's as well beforehand.
Oh, well, yeah. Feel free to ping me a message if you want me to come on your show. I'd love to.
Oh yeah, 100%. I'll message you after this.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Molly. Yeah, so I think we'll end it there. It's been a great hour. Some really great chats and discussions. Felt very informal, which is always great. But yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Natalie, and Meehika again, and also Simran, co-hosting, fab co-host. But yeah, I hope you have a lovely weekend. And yeah, thank you very much
for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.